Good morning. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and welcome you to our virtual program entitled Seeking Strategic Advantage, How Geopolitical Competition and Cooperation Are Playing Out in Space. This program is sponsored by the Center's Science, Technology, and Innovation Program, brilliantly directed by Meg King, and the Aerospace Corporation, located in my former congressional district in California. And we are turning our attention away from earthly matters, to my great personal relief, at least for the next 2 hours, and toward the stars. Our conversation focuses on space exploration, defense, geopolitics, and the critical technology, think satellites, that enables Zoom events like this one, along with many other important things. Later this morning, we'll have 2 panels on the threat landscape and opportunities for public-private partnership in space exploration. But first, we're going to be joined for a keynote by our friend, former NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. NASA is on a roll, or perhaps I should say, it's really taking off. In May, we all watched in awe as NASA and SpaceX launched the first crewed mission from US soil since 2011, and the first one ever to use a commercial rocket. Then in July, NASA launched Perseverance, a new Mars rover. Later this month, 4 more US astronauts will leave for the International Space Station. And all throughout, NASA has worked on the Orion spacecraft and Space Launch System, the most powerful rocket ever built, and part of the Artemis plan to land the first woman and next man on the moon by 2024. There have been challenges too, as I'm sure Jim will tell us, and our panelists will explain that space has become congested, contested, and competitive. Now that more state, non-state, and private sector actors are joining in. This is something I really know about from a role I play with a company called Iridium. Jim and I have a lot in common. We both served in Congress, though we didn't overlap, since he represented Oklahoma in the House from 2013 to 2018 while I was at the Wilson Center. But we both spent a lot of time thinking deeply about space. I co-chaired the Congressional Space Caucus and represented what I called the aerospace capital of the universe in the South Bay of Los Angeles, including, as I mentioned, the Aerospace Corporation and its neighbor, the Los Angeles Air Force Base, SMC. It was there in El Segundo, where both are located, that about 2 decades ago, I went to see a rental property with sawdust on the floor where some kid named Elon was making rockets using Russian technology. We know how that movie turned out. So back to Jim, who was a former naval aviator and former executive director of the Tulsa Air and Space Museum, giving him great credentials as a member of key space committees like Science and Armed Services. Jim, were you really a Top Gun? Got to hear about that. Jim once favored, there he is. Yes? Is the answer yes?
I was. I did Red Air. So my job was to fly around on enemy profiles and get shot down bravely by Top Gun instructors. So I did that for 3 years, enjoyed it very much. So I was a target. How about that?
I won't accept that formulation, but you're still a Top Gun. You're still a real pioneer and leader in space.
Thank you.
Jim, you once famously said that our very way of life depends on space, the way we communicate, the way we navigate, the way we produce food and energy, the way we conduct banking. That's why we're so pleased you're here and back at the Wilson Center. I mentioned earlier that Jim was actually at the Wilson Center last time, and we have a big wall where which all our speakers sign. And of course, his signature is way, way at the top in space, and no one can equal that. So again, welcome back, Jim. And let me also mention that after your keynote, our partner, Steve Izakowicz, who's president and CEO of the Aerospace Corporation now, will say a few words. By the way, to Steve, your predecessor, Wanda Austin, is a dear friend of mine, and she and I spent a lot of time together there. And subsequently, when she became the acting president of the University of Southern California, but it was Wanda, I would point out, just in closing, who built a bridge between the Aerospace Corporation and the LA Air Force Base over a busy street. She built that bridge ahead of time and below budget. So it takes a woman to do something like that. But my other comment is that bridge is what we need to be building in this broken town where I am speaking, between the political parties. And I think that, and I see Jim nodding, I think that space, or the love of space, or the inspiration space offers, is the way to rebuild that bridge that has sadly frayed. And if we can replenish the dream that John Kennedy started, let's remember that, in the early 60s, replenish that dream of the US leading in space. And we're trying to do that. I think that that is the way to cause young people to come together and to imagine their own lives in roles around space, and their own lives building a stronger and better country. So with that, please join me in welcoming a friend of the Wilson Center and a friend of mine, Jim Bridenstine.
Well, thank you, Jane, so much. It is an honor to be back with you. And of course, we did not overlap in the House, but I followed your work even, when you were on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, which of course deals a lot with space as well. A lot of important capabilities that you were involved in. And of course, your leadership there at the Wilson Center has been fantastic. The Wilson Center is one of those institutions that not just members of Congress, but I think the national security and foreign relations communities really turn to for a lot of the thought leadership that comes from the Wilson Center. And so when you invited me to participate in this panel, and I love what, bringing together, the competition along with the cooperation, and how it forms our grand strategy for the nation, not just space, but for the nation. I think NASA plays an absolutely critical role. And I'll give some examples. When we talk about national power, a lot of people think about military power. When you go through joint professional military education, the M in DIME comes out a lot. DIME, of course, so it's an acronym that outlines the elements of national power. Diplomatic power is the D, information power is the I, military power is the M, and economic power is the E. And where NASA does not play, we don't play on that military side. We are not a defense organization. We're not tasked with fighting and winning wars in space. But I'll tell you, we benefit from security in space. And as you identified, Jane, space is becoming very competitive and very congested. And we need to make sure that we as a nation are leading the world in a process whereby space can be preserved for generations to come. And NASA plays an important role there. So when we think about this DIME theory of national power, the D, I think, is where NASA plays really, really strongly, diplomatic power. So we've been operating the International Space Station. Next month, we will celebrate 20 years of having American astronauts and Russian cosmonauts living and working together in space for 20 years on the International Space Station. That's going to happen next month. That's a significant achievement. And when we think about all of the terrestrial challenges that the two nations have, and the idea that we can still cooperate and collaborate in space, I think that's meaningful. And I think it gives hope, not just to this nation, but to the entire world. So when we think about that relationship, it didn't just start with the International Space Station. People remember the Space Shuttle Mir program. Mir was a Soviet space station that eventually became a Russian space station. And a lot of people remember going back to the early 1970s. In fact, 1975 was the Apollo-Soyuz program. So we have this history of collaborating with Russia, even in some of the most challenging times, including the height of the Cold War. So I do think that there is a diplomatic element to what we do. It's not just an element, it's a strong piece of what we do. And that diplomacy is not just with Russia. It's the European Space Agency, it's Japan, it's Canada, it's the United States. All these nations, there's 15 nations, I think actually 14 nations with the European Space Agency, 14 nations that have been operating the International Space Station now for 20 years. We've had astronauts from 19 different countries. We've had experiments on the International Space Station from 103 different countries. And currently, if you go into all of our science programs, you mentioned Perseverance, which is on its way to Mars right now, and our probes that have gone through the solar system, and even our Earth science missions today. You add it all up, we currently have over 700 international agreements that are active, which is an amazing capability to partner with countries that sometimes you wouldn't even think would be a partner in space exploration. But we're bringing more countries in all the time. New countries are creating space agencies, and we want to bring them into what we're trying to achieve in space. So the diplomatic piece, I think, is really strong, and that's where NASA plays very, very well. The second piece, the information piece, when we think about grand strategy, we think about moments in time when the United States of America was able to prove that its political and economic system were superior to that of, we go back to the 1960s, the former Soviet Union. And we all remember Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon. Of course, I'm the first NASA administrator that wasn't born yet when that event occurred, but certainly we watched it. Growing up, I watched it in classes in elementary school even. So here's what's amazing. We talk about that I in DIME, information power. There was a moment in time when the entire world watched as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. And they went with a message of peace and unity. And behind the Iron Curtain, where it was very difficult to reach, we were able to reach behind the Iron Curtain with a message that said, hey, the United States of America has the ability to technologically do marvelous things. We have the ability with our political and economic system to have a powerful economy that can pull off these achievements. And so that I in DIME, I think, it's relevant today. Even we just saw, Jane, last year, we celebrated 50 years of the Apollo 11 moon landing, and we had hundreds of thousands. It was over 500,000 people on the National Mall to celebrate that stunning achievement. And what was fascinating, I know, Jane, you and I have both seen hundreds of thousands of people on the National Mall before. They're never happy. In this case, people were there to celebrate something good that was bipartisan, that was apolitical, that was international. When I say it was international, it was an American-only kind of effort, but it was about humanity reaching another world for the first time and taking those first steps. So I think that information piece is critically important. When I first became the NASA administrator, we had a mission on the way to Mars called InSight. And InSight was a lander. It's still there doing great work on Mars. It's helping us understand what is Mars like inside. But when we landed InSight on Mars, it was on the cover of every newspaper worldwide. And that's a great tool of information, including it was in a newspaper that it's a Tehran newspaper, if you can imagine. And the subtitle was the hardline newspaper of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now, they don't generally say nice things about the United States of America, but when we landed on Mars, they had a story in there that was amazing about this achievement. It very clearly said that this was the 8th time in human history that landing on Mars softly has been achieved. Each time it was achieved by the United States of America. And this time when we went with a coalition of international partners, and it named all of those partners. So that's the kind of thing, if you can reach into Tehran, if you can reach beyond the Iron Curtain and share good messages about the United States of America, that is a tool that very few, if any, agencies in the United States of America have the ability to achieve. And so that information power has the ability to maybe reshape the ideas of young people towards the United States of America. So they're not just getting ugly stories about the United States, but they see this stunning achievement and they think to themselves, why are we not part of that mission? How come I'm not part of that mission? I want to be involved in these kind of exploration initiatives. So I think that tool of information power is very important. So we talked about diplomacy, we talked about information. On the M side, military power, NASA is not, we don't play there. We intentionally don't play there. When Dwight Eisenhower created NASA in 1958, there was a lot of pressure on him to have it be within the military industrial complex. And he absolutely rejected that because he wanted it to be used for a tool of diplomacy. And you can't have it both ways. You can't have it be a warfighting force and a tool of diplomacy. We need both, make no mistake, but if you're going to partner with nations that are difficult to partner with in a lot of other ways, then it needs to maintain its separation, which it has since 1958. So then I will also say, when you think about that industrial base, we do share an industrial base when it comes to rocket launches and satellite buses and all of the capabilities that we have in space. That industrial base in the United States is second to none. NASA benefits from that greatly. The Department of Defense benefits from that greatly. And so there's a lot of synergies there, even though NASA doesn't do defense. Then we talk about the E in DIME, which is economic power. And this, of course, is another area where NASA plays very, very strongly. A couple of things when we talk about economic power. Right now, I'm talking to you through a camera in a computer. This camera was developed for a Mars mission back in the 1990s. And then it was licensed for the first time to Nokia, which put it into a cell phone. And from there, it became this thing where everybody had to have a camera in their cell phones. So this is one example. But then we think about satellite communications. I know, Jane, you mentioned Iridium. So a perfect example of satellite communications, when we think about DirecTV, Dish Network, internet broadband from space, connecting the world. There's a lot of people in rural Oklahoma, which is, I come from Oklahoma. I used to represent Oklahoma. A lot of people in rural Oklahoma would not have the internet at all if it were not for internet broadband from space. So it connects the world. So we think about all of those communication tools, XM radio. Those are all ways of communicating that were born from this little agency called NASA, which had an agenda to go to the moon in the 1960s. And it has transformed how we're able to think about the pandemic and how we're all communicating now in the midst of the pandemic. These technologies, they make no mistake, they have been commercialized, they've been privatized, and they have run with it. But they were all born from this little agency called NASA in the early days. But it's not just communication, it's navigation. We think about GPS, it's a DoD capability, but originally when it was first initiated, NASA was very involved in it. We think about and how navigation has transformed how all of us live today. We think about how we produce food, how we produce energy, how we do disaster relief, predict weather. All of our weather satellites are built by NASA. When we think about weather, 80% of the data that goes into our national weather models to help us predict when it's going to rain and where it's going to rain, 80% of that data is coming from satellites in space built by NASA that are now operated by NOAA. So we think about the ability to predict weather, the ability to understand our climate, which is changing. All of these things are things that NASA is uniquely capable of delivering, and this is just the beginning. And we think about how it has transformed our country and transformed technology in this nation. There's so many things to talk about. I'll tell you one thing that I hear about as the NASA administrator. I hear about Tang and Velcro. And I'll tell you, we've done a lot since Tang and Velcro, just so everybody is aware. But it's also important to remember that that all the technologies I just talked about, that was not envisioned in the Apollo program. That's not what the Apollo program was about. But because we were doing these very technologically difficult things, we invented things. And that's really where we are today. We're going to the moon this time sustainably. We're going to stay at the moon. We're going to learn how to live and work for long periods of time. We're going to have the ability to use the resources of the moon, hundreds of millions of tons of water ice, which represents air to breathe and water to drink. We're also going to take all of that knowledge and hydrogen, H2O, that's hydrogen. Hydrogen is rocket fuel. It's available in hundreds of millions of tons on the surface of the moon. We take all of that knowledge and we're going to go to Mars. Now, Mars that's the horizon goal, and the whole world wants to go to Mars. In fact, the whole world wants to go to the moon. Another area where we see so much diplomatic engagement. We had a meeting the other day, invited countries that wanted to be part of the Artemis program. And we had 26 nations show up. A good chunk of those nations don't even have space programs, but they want to be part of Artemis. They want to see the first woman on the moon, and they want to be able to say they were a part of it. Another amazing tool of diplomacy. But we go from the moon to Mars. This is American leadership at its finest. It incorporates all the elements of national power, diplomatic, information, small m military in the sense that we share an industrial base, and then of course big E on the economic power of our country. So Jane, I'll stop here. I know there's probably people that want to ask questions, and I'll just open it up. But our agency is doing great work. We have strong bipartisan support. Man, I've worked so hard on that. Thrilled that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle are stepping forward and supporting the Artemis program. We need that. It needs to be a multi-decadal kind of effort for a sustainable return to the moon so that we can eventually go to Mars.
Neil, I was thinking of Neil Armstrong. Jim, thank you so much. I'd love you to give that whole speech again right now, because I think people like me, and I assume everyone else zooming in to hear you, haven't been at our happiest in the last weeks. And you are hopeful, and you are talking about the United States projecting soft power in a way that will make the world more peaceful. And that message just is not getting through very often. So if you're not going to give that speech again, I want you to be the first person I talk to every morning, so that I kind of set myself up for smiling, maybe even laughing at a few things during the day. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, is this administration lucky to have you in that position. Gotta say, I mean, you're just a huge gift to America. You're a huge gift. So let me just ask you a few questions. You heard me talk about this kid named Elon who had the rockets on the floor of this rental in El Segundo. I think everybody understands whom I'm talking about. And most of us have seen his sleek digs at the Hawthorne Airport, where his rocket factory is phenomenal. But you've paired NASA with SpaceX, a private company, on missions. I just was talking about the one that happened recently. And you pair with others. You were talking about that. Tell us about public-private partnerships and why they are key to NASA's continued success.
Absolutely. So the goal is we want to create sustainable programs that go on for the long term. And when we think about Apollo, as much as we all love Apollo, it ended. And that was a problem. We went from the Apollo program until the space shuttle program. We had an 8-year gap. And then after the space shuttle retired, we ended up having another 9-year gap before we launched Commercial Crew just a few months ago. So all of these things, Commercial Crew, of course, was the Falcon 9 rocket with the Dragon crew capsule, which was a SpaceX NASA partnership. And we launched American astronauts again from American soil, but we had a 9-year gap. So what we're trying to do is make sure that what we develop for the future is in fact sustainable. And so NASA's goal in low Earth orbit especially, but even beyond, in low Earth orbit where the International Space Station is NASA wants to be one customer of many customers in a very robust commercial marketplace for human spaceflight. We also want not just to be one customer, but we want to have numerous providers that are competing against each other on cost and innovation and safety, driving down costs and increasing access. And so we think about what we've done. We're now resupplying the International Space Station with commercial resupply vehicles. The next step is, and we're pretty much there already, we're launching astronauts to the International Space Station with commercial crew. We've done our first test flight, our first crewed flight that is an official crewed flight, not just a test flight, is going to happen here at the end of this month, October 31st. And then we think about what comes next. We all know the International Space Station, as marvelous as it is, it can't last forever. So we have to be thinking about what comes next. So commercial habitation for humans in low Earth orbit. I envision a day where NASA is a customer, and instead of having a massive International Space Station, we would have a dozen smaller space stations that are public-private partnerships with NASA and industry. So we think about, like, on the space station right now, we are proving that we can compound pharmaceuticals in microgravity in a way that you cannot do on Earth, and it's resulting in saving of lives. Same with immunizations. We're advancing the immunizations for salmonella and for pneumonia on the International Space Station, using this valuable tool of microgravity to help us understand not just the human immune system, but how these immunizations work. And then we're proving that we can actually print human organs in 3D on the International Space Station. So all of these will result, using adult stem cells, we can print human organs in 3D. All these will result in, what we would call an industrialized biomedicine capability in space. The value being microgravity, which you can't recreate here on Earth. But it's not just industrial biomedicine, it's advanced materials. But the goal is, as we work on the International Space Station day in and day out, we're making an effort to commercialize all of these capabilities so that the private sector will capitalize and move forward. And NASA can again be a customer and have numerous providers that compete on cost and innovation. The goal here, Jane, is sustainability. If the government is the only game in town, then it's always a zero-sum game. And if you fund something else, you got to take away from another area. The goal here is a robust public-private partnership so that NASA can use its resources to go places where there isn't yet a commercial marketplace, namely the moon, but always seeking to retire the risk so that commercial will eventually take that over as well.
But you have to promise me one thing, Jim. When we go to all these places, promise me we will not take our toxic politics with us.
Yeah.
Promise me.
I'll tell you, right? You have my word, but I'll tell you, if you look at the areas where we have the most political support in an apolitical, bipartisan way, I'm telling you, look at NASA's budget. This is it's important for the nation, and it's recognized.
I agree. And when I served on the science committee, which I did early in my career, a guy named George Brown, who was a rather large Democrat from California, was its chairman. And he said, I want to be the first old fat guy to float around in space. And obviously we've gone a few generations since then, but it's exciting. So explain to us. I just have a couple more brief questions because we have a wonderful program to follow. Why does it matter to go to Mars or to the moon? Why does it matter? And you just mentioned to develop commercial technologies, but is that the whole answer?
My goodness, this is an hour-long kind of answer, but I'll start with Mars. So in the last 2.5 years, we have found complex organic compounds all over the surface of Mars. Those are the building blocks for life. They exist on the Earth, they exist on Mars, but they're not on the moon at all. But they're all over Mars. So the probability of finding life has gone up. Then we think about, we have found potentially liquid water 12 kilometers under the surface of Mars, where it's protected from the radiation of deep space. So what do we know about liquid water? Wherever it exists on Earth, there's life. Is that true on Mars? We don't know, but we should go find out. The other thing that we have found is that the methane cycles of Mars match the seasons of Mars. which again it's not a guarantee of life, but it's the probability keeps going up. And now we have found massive plumes of methane, which a lot of scientists are saying that's unlikely that that's geological in nature. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to find life on Mars. I don't know, neither does anybody else, but we need to be leading an international effort to go make sure that if it's there, we find it. So those are very exciting developments. We also know, because of Spirit and Opportunity of the 1990s, 2000s, and even the let's see, Opportunity lasted until just a few years ago, I think 2018. We know that Mars was covered, the northern hemisphere of Mars was covered in a liquid ocean 3 billion years ago. It had a strong magnetosphere that protected it from the radiation of deep space. It had a thick atmosphere, much like Earth. In other words, Mars 3 billion years ago was habitable. And now we're finding, like even today with Curiosity and soon with Perseverance, we're going to be finding more and more evidence that Mars was at one time habitable. Just, we just found, I say we, it was actually the British that did it, but they found in the upper atmosphere of Venus, phosphine, which is a compound that we only know exists from anaerobic biology. And it was in the upper atmosphere of Venus. That doesn't mean there's not some chemical capability out there that we don't understand. But as we know it, phosphine is only exists because of anaerobic biology, and it's in the upper atmosphere of Venus. We also found about 10 years ago, we found microbial life at 120,000 feet in Earth's atmosphere. So my point is this: if we find life on another world, it's going to fundamentally transform how we think about exploration going forward. And it's a very exciting time. Our two nearest neighbors actually provide a lot of hope that we could find life on another world. And so I think that's why we need to do that. At the moon, like I said, we found hundreds of millions of tons of water ice, which is life support. It's air to breathe. It's water to drink. It's rocket fuel. But the other thing is the moon it's a scientific capability unlike any other. On the far side of the moon, it's very, very quiet from an electromagnetic spectrum perspective, which means from the far side of the moon, we're actually building missions where we're going to see not just the first light in the universe, we're going to see the dark ages. After the Big Bang and before first light occurred, we're going to be able to see what the universe was like. And we're going to be able to do that from the far side of the moon. So from an astrophysics perspective, it's tremendously valuable. From a solar system perspective, the moon is a repository of charged particles coming from the sun for billions of years. And they are today right where they were billions of years ago, because the moon doesn't have an active geology or an active atmosphere or an active hydrosphere. So the moon is a repository of data and science information of the early solar system. It's also the launching point to get to Mars. So all of that is necessary for our eventual Mars missions.
Well, I could blow through this whole program and talk to you all morning, but you're busy and I'm busy.
Yes, ma'am.
And we have a great program. And I did want to mention, I didn't recognize him yet, that Chris Davenport is going to chair one of the panels, was a Wilson Fellow. That's why he's so important in life. That's in your dreams, Jim. Sometime in the future, you can be a Wilson Fellow too. But he's the author of Space Barons, which brilliantly describes the space race by 3 different groups for low Earth orbit. And it's, I loved it. And we're all in space. And awesome. I just want to thank you so much. I actually watched Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk on the moon. Wow. And it was a long time ago. But I think the excitement of that moment and the excitement of what John Kennedy said even before that is matched by your own excitement about what you do and what the future is. And I'm blown away by this. I think it's a hopeful and wonderful thing that you, the administration and the rest of us are doing to focus on space and to both provide resources for the government, but also the incentive for the private sector to work together and for our politics not to be part of this. So thank you, Jim. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Steve Izakowicz, who heads the Aerospace Corporation in the best congressional district on Earth. to take over for a few moments.
Hello, I'm excited to be joining you all today. First, I want to say thank you to the NASA Administrator, Jim Bridenstine, for making time to be with us and for sharing his thoughtful insights on NASA's important role in foreign policy. And congratulations on the 20th anniversary of the International Space Station. I remember working with NASA in those early days to have a cooperative agreement with the Russians, and it really is an incredible case study of important foreign diplomacy. I also want to thank Jane Harman and the Wilson Center for hosting this outstanding event. And Jane, thanks for acknowledging my predecessor, Wanda Austin, and the real symbolic importance of the bridge we built at Aerospace. It's an honor for Aerospace to be partnered with the Wilson Center today. And thanks to all of you who are taking the time out of your busy schedules to hear more about the exciting times we find ourselves in. As you all know, we're living through one of the most dynamic times the space enterprise has ever seen, certainly in the last 50 years. In just the past year, we've seen the stand-up of launches under the US Space Force, astronauts being carried to the International Space Station through NASA's innovative Commercial Crew Program, and the first national security space launch was conducted using a booster that was later successfully recovered. At the same time, adversary nations continue to develop new threats to challenge US superiority in space. Space is now a more contested domain, and we can't take US dominance for granted any longer. All of these factors and many more set the stage for what promises to be a transformative decade in space. In the coming years, our entire concept of what we know about space and how we operate in space will be reshaped. We'll need to forge new partnerships, craft smart regulations, and usher in new ways of thinking about space. What made the US dominant in space during the 20th century won't be enough to keep us ahead in the 21st century. These great changes represent a tremendous opportunity to shape the future of space, and the potential benefits to humankind are enormous. The decisions we are making today and in the coming decade will matter immensely and will determine what's possible for future generations. We have the expertise, the technology, and the ability to make sound decisions that contribute untold breakthroughs in space. But doing so will require leadership, vision, and cooperation, both between nations and with the many emerging operators looking to utilize space in new and exciting ways. At the Aerospace Corporation, we have a unique perspective that comes from touching every part of the space enterprise, from military and international and intelligence users to civil agencies and commercial players. To help spark and inform discussion about what the many important issues and opportunities facing the US space enterprise in the years ahead, Aerospace's Center for Space Policy and Strategy has put together a project called Space Agenda 2021. It is a series of over 24 papers featuring in-depth looks at a range of topics that will shape the future of space. This includes organizing for national security space, space deterrence, space power doctrine, game-changing technologies, cislunar space development, leveraging commercial development, space traffic management, to name a few. It's intended to be a comprehensive look at space policy issues that the nation will face in the next presidential term. We released 4 papers last month and have several more that will be available this week on our website, aerospace.org. Future releases are planned through October and November. Today, we have 2 stellar panels organized for you that touch on some of the most important topics in our Space Agenda 2021. The first is on defense space partnerships and the weaponization of space. It will explore how the US can navigate an increasingly complex threat landscape to ensure its leadership in space and the role of international cooperation will play in safeguarding space. The second panel is on cooperating in a crowded space environment as we see an increase in the number and types of entities looking to utilize space. This includes the rise of commercial endeavors and the potential for public-private partnerships to bolster investment and ensure the sustainability of human space exploration and utilization. We're very fortunate to have Christian Davenport from the Washington Post joining us today as the moderator for these panels. Thanks to Chris and our panelists for sharing their extensive knowledge with us on these important issues. I know we're all excited to hear their discussion, so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Chris. Chris?
Hey, thanks so much, Steve. Thanks to you and to Jane, the Wilson Center, and the Aerospace Corporation for having us, and thanks for setting up the stage for today. You know, it's interesting, we think a lot about space as a layperson, as a peaceful sanctuary. We think about it, you know, as we were just hearing Jim Bridenstine, the NASA administrator, we think about exploration, Apollo, and now Artemis. But the truth is, it's long been a contested domain. And what we're seeing now in the last decade or so is really an increase of that. And we've got three excellent experts to join us on the panel today. Dr. Jessica West is a senior researcher at Project Plowshares, which is a research institute based in Canada. We've got Jamie Morin, the executive director at your agency there, Steve, the Aerospace Corporation's Center for Policy and Strategy, and of course, Dr. Brian Whedon, the director of program planning at the Secure World Foundation. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to join us. I thought we would start out by just mentioning that, this comes on the 1-year anniversary on the standing up of the Space Force, which I want to talk about. But before we get into that, I thought it would be useful to maybe talk about some of the issues and concerns and problems that the Space Force is designed to combat and solve. So I wonder if the three of you might take a moment to sort of outline for us, what the threat landscape is, who our potential adversaries are, what their capabilities are, and what the main concerns are to sort of set the stage for the rest of the conversation. And I thought, Jamie, if it's okay with you, we might begin with you. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Christian. And really appreciate the opportunity to join folks from the Wilson Center, as well as colleagues on the panel. There's an enormous amount of activity going on in space right now, and we hear a lot about the challenges and the threats. But it's also important to note this is a moment of immense opportunity. Your book from a couple of years ago did a really nice job of chronicling that. In the last decade, I think US commercial companies have made enormous progress as part of a burgeoning space industry around the world. But there are real challenges, and I tend to loop them into a set of sort of three broad observations that relate to the classic C's that we hear about space. So we see space as increasingly crowded. We see it as contested or conflictual. We also see it as increasingly democratized. And that's the one I would focus in on here, because the number of actors that are playing in space and the basis from which they operate is dramatically different than where we were in the Cold War. It's not just a US and Soviet Union world. It's not just a world dominated by governments, even though our overarching governance for space still requires national authorization for private space activity. But that democratization, the fact that there are many more nations playing and there are subnational actors of real influence, means we cannot solve the problems of sustainability and security in space unilaterally or just by signing policy documents. We need, as the US, we need to lead collaboratively and construct a set of norms that'll help us succeed in the long run in space. And that's why the center that Steve asked me to lead is in the midst of releasing this whole series of papers addressing these issues. We're trying to capture the biggest topics for the future of US global leadership in space. We've got 13 that are out and 5 more released today and 10 more coming between now and December to really define the space agenda for 2021. That's going to help us think through for the US in a moment of change, how do we address the challenges coming from China, the challenges coming from Russia, the challenges coming to US scientific and economic leadership, as well as military leadership, from this dramatic democratization of the domain and the new players. And above all, how do we harness this moment of opportunity? Because we've got extraordinary bases of national power, as Administrator Bridenstine noted, right? We've got the entire DIME of power, and we have some real strengths in several of those letters that we need to draw on as part of a coherent, unified strategy.
Yeah, that's great. Jessica, I wonder if you would, sort of carry on Jamie's comments coming from Plowshares, how you view, sort of the threat landscape and what needs to be done ultimately to deter conflict in space.
Yeah, hi. It's really exciting to be here with the Wilson Center. I really like Jamie's comments, and I think I would agree we're in a unique moment. And so you mentioned the Space Force, which is, a year into getting stood up, and some of the challenges that they're facing. And obviously, the mantra of the Space Force is focused on warfighting in space and having a warfighting mission. But to me, I think that the threat environment is much wider. And from an international perspective, a global peace perspective, I think we face a situation where there are a number of states who are actively preparing for the potential of conflict in space, but we don't have a good basis of knowledge for understanding what that looks like, and for understanding how can we make that compatible with all of the wonderful things that Jim Bridenstine just told us about that are happening in space. How do we do war fighting in space, but also create an environment that is sustainable and stable for commercial operators and scientific operators and peaceful exploration? How do we contain conflict from escalating to the point where we cause damage to the environment or where we cause damage to other operators in space? And I know there's a lot of work being done on deterrence, a big revival of deterrence this year or these days, but I also think from that perspective, there are critical questions to keep asking. How does the United States deter aggression without inviting an arms race in space? How do we do deterrence and maintain a stable environment? And those don't necessarily go hand in hand. I think there's a lot of thinking and engagement that has to be done. Norms, which Jamie mentioned, are certainly part of that equation, and something that I think there's a real opportunity to do a lot more on this, to focus on the stability side rather than the warfighting side.
Yeah, and I want to get to that because that's, that the D in DIME that the administrator was talking about. Brian, I wanted to ask you, at the Secure World Foundation, you have authored with some colleagues really comprehensive reports that detail country by country what their capabilities are and what the threats are. I wonder if you could give us sort of the Cliff's Notes version of that.
Sure, happy to do so. And thanks again to the Wilson Center for inviting me to participate in today's event. So, what we're seeing is sort of reflecting on what Jamie said, back during the Cold War, you had this rivalry, this national security rivalry in space between the US and Soviet Union that a lot of people weren't aware of because they were focused on what was happening with, sort of the more public NASA version. What we've seen over the last, I'm going to say 15 years or so, is a return to that mindset or that development and that focus on developing anti-satellite weapons and counter capabilities from several countries. There was a brief period of time, let's call it in the mid to late 1990s, maybe in the very early 2000s, where there was less of a focus, but it has come back. So we're tracking in our report that we've been working on, and also I'll mention colleagues of ours at CSIS have a similar report that we collaborate with. What we're seeing is, the big three, Russia, China, and the United States, are all developing a suite of counter space capabilities that range from things like jamming and temporary reversible laser dazzling, all the way up to hard kill kinetic things like ground launched direct ascent ASAT weapons, potentially even co-orbital ASAT weapons that can get close to their satellite. There's a lot of research and development going on. There's even some operational testing going on. And so there's quite a bit of concern that as these capabilities get developed and as they come out and sort of become more operational, are they going to be used in a future conflict? And to both points that Jamie and Jessica mentioned, some of these weapons, particularly the more destructive ones, we've already seen them be used in the testing. I'm thinking back to the 2007 Chinese anti-satellite test. That created a whole lot of orbital debris that has presented a challenge for all space actors for the last decade since the test, and will for the future. So if there is a future conflict and there's someone who's going to use these capabilities, that could have huge challenges for everyone. We've also seen this spread beyond just those big three countries. India last year and this year, India last year tested its first anti-satellite weapon, which was kind of a surprise to some, but they've got a burgeoning military national space program and national interest in space of their own. We've also seen more recently France and Japan both talk about the potential for them to develop their own counter-space capabilities. And so the question going forward is, how many more countries are going to decide that they need to join in this competition and develop their own capabilities? And then what does that mean for the proliferation of these technologies and capabilities around the world?
Yeah, just real quick, Brian, for a layperson's audience, I wonder if you just take a quick moment to talk about what those capabilities and technologies are. You mentioned the 2007 anti-satellite weapon that China fired. That was a missile that hit, I believe it was a dead weather satellite, which showed that they could fire a missile and hit a satellite, which is hard to do. But when you talk about the threats, it's much more than all of that. You touched on that briefly, but just real quick, set the stage of what we're talking about here.
Sure. So there's a wide variety of ways you can do bad things with satellite or disrupt its ability to provide whatever it's doing, imagery, communications, whatever. So the first thing I'll talk about is cyber attacks. You can try and get into the computers of the ground station that controls the satellite to try and disrupt that. You can try and get into or disrupt the devices that someone is using to receive signals or imagery from that satellite. Or you can try and launch a cyber attack on the satellite itself. So that's one way. A second way is through electronic warfare. We commonly think of as jamming. You can broadcast signals that can make it difficult to detect the signals being broadcast by the satellite to the point where this interference, you just can't receive it. You can try and spoof the signals to create fake ones that could trick users into using it. So those are generally called temporary means, where you're not harming the satellite's still fine, but if I'm an end user trying to get a GPS signal, I may have no signal, or my GPS unit may show that I'm actually very far away from where I actually am because of the interference or the spoofing. Next big category is directed energy. This is what commonly refers to as lasers. This is still a little bit sci-fi in that, what we're talking about here is at the moment, lasers from the ground or from aircraft that we call dazzle a satellite, i.e., it's almost like shining a bright light in your eyes where you temporarily go blind, you may see some spots, you have trouble seeing. That is sort of what we're seeing used or deployed operationally. But in the future, we could see more powerful lasers that could actually physically damage satellites. And then there's the two that sort of people think about the most, which are direct ascent ASATs and co-orbital. Direct ascent ASATs are essentially a missile with a little kill vehicle on top, launched from the ground, or either or a plane or a ship that collides with the satellite. And that collision occurs at thousands of kilometers per second and just obliterates both objects. Co-orbital means you've launched something into space that then changes its orbit to get close to another satellite. And then it could do a whole variety of things, from colliding to maybe breaking off an arm or just getting in its way, or there's a variety of things you can do once you've gotten close to try and do things. So we're seeing all of those being developed.
So yeah, thanks for that, Brian. That's really helpful. So Jamie, obviously people at the Pentagon and the intelligence community, and I'm sure the State Department, have been looking at this, excuse me, for a number of years, and realizing well before the Trump administration and the advent of the Space Force that this was a concern. But now that we have the Space Force, I'll ask sort of a typical newspapery reporter question that probably lacks nuance, and I'll rely on you for the sophistication and the expertise on it. But we've had it for a year. What has the Space Force done? What has it accomplished? Are we safer now, and what's to come? And yeah, unmute. There you go.
Thank you. So it's a terrific question, and it's also a terrifically unfair question. The military and civilian leaders who were charged with setting up the Space Force, I think it's fair to say they went into the congressional debate on the creation of a new military service, assuming that they would be asked to stand something up with something on the order of 18 months or 2 years lead time before they were required to kind of function in the Pentagon environment as an independent military service. That's not what the law in the end said. The law in the end said essentially effective immediately. And so the analogy, if you remember the old ad of the guys building a plane in mid-flight, that is absolutely what they were asked to do. And they were also directed to do it with no additional resources, without increasing the manning of the organizations, and with a pretty modest initial stand-up budget. So this is a tough challenge. They've been plugging away at it. The thing I'd highlight is there is still actually not a complete consensus on the problems that this new military service was created to solve. Or put it a little differently, and this is something that Administrator Bridenstine and Congresswoman Harman certainly understand. There was a log roll of different advocates with different views of what the problems were in space. And they came together and they agreed on a solution without necessarily agreeing on the problem. So some folks believed space acquisition took too long and costed too much. Some believed that military space operators were insufficiently operational or insufficiently focused on contestation of potential adversaries' actions. Others believed that we had a promotion problem and we weren't getting enough space leaders rising to the top of the Air Force and the other services. And those views came together with a potential solution, but they still haven't actually really been fully adjudicated. General Jay Raymond, who's the Chief of Space Operations, has said he needs a new service to be effective. It needs to control a budget. It needs to have a doctrine, have some core principles that it stands for, and a concept of what war means and what its role is in it. It needs to be able to develop its own people. And those are all big challenges. They're stepping out on each of them. But I think the latter of those, the developing of the people, is the one that will, of necessity, take the longest. And assuming the nation continues to go down this path and stand up this service, the developing and selection of those people is going to be the most critical variable for its success. Can they build the necessary skills to operate in an engineered, highly technical domain with still with reference to sort of the fundamental principles of military operations and warfare that are likely to apply across any area? And can they get the balance right between space for space's sake, dominance and control of a military operating domain, versus exploitation of space for broader national purposes down here on Earth? Those are the two things they've got to be able to do, and striking that balance will require people who can think both for their own domain and all the joint domains that they're enabling.
Just a quick follow on that. It's something you mentioned, and I'll rely on the expertise of the audience that the Wilson Center attracts. Go out on a limb, because it's always dangerous in a panel to ask a procurement or acquisition question, but it's so immensely important. And we heard Heather Wilson just recently, I think, talk about that there were 7 different agencies that could buy and procure space equipment. It seems like that could be something that could be streamlined. I know they're trying to do that. Do you have a sense of what the status of that is? And is that something they could tackle earlier rather than later?
Sure. So what we know so far here is, first, the administration created with a report that they issued a couple years ago, a new space acquisition agency, the Space Development Agency. So that added to the pool of players. That agency, I think it's best to think of it as having its mission focused on two things. First, exploiting the commercial energy in low Earth orbit. So a heavy focus on commercial. I'm sorry, I've given you both of my points simultaneously. It's a heavy focus on commercial derivative or application of commercial technology, and it's a heavy focus on low Earth orbit, which is an area where the US military has not done a lot of operations. You know, there's a handful of satellites, but it's not a major portion of the focus for the US military. So that's where the Space Development Agency exists. We have a Space Rapid Capabilities Office, which hasn't said too much about what it's specifically looking to do right now, but they tend to talk about operations in a contested domain and quickly fielding capability that responds to adversary actions. You have the Space and Missile Systems Center, and with the stand-up of the US Space Force, they've indicated that they'll create a Space Systems Command that they envision as eventually encompassing those three other organizations and coordinating across them. I think this is not, and of course the Missile Defense Agency is buying some limited satellite capability as part of their focus on space sensing. I don't think it's crazy to have those three agencies within this Future Space Systems Command, because I do think culturally, developing really complex things that take a long time draws on a different set of program management and technical skills than does rapidly fielding things that have to respond to adversaries' potential actions and aggressive development, than does harnessing and applying technology that is predominantly coming out of the commercial sector. Those are actually different skill sets, require leaders and managers with different sets of connections. So it doesn't really hurt my head to have those in separate areas. But the really hard problem is figuring out which of those solution sets applies to each of your problems. And you're going to have entrepreneurial companies and internal entrepreneurs within government service and military service who are going to push up against those lines and say, hey, you've been trying to solve this problem with a big and exquisite satellite, try solving it with a proliferated network. And we see that going on today. That's, I think, where the really interesting questions are going to be.
Yeah, it's interesting how it almost, in some regards, becomes a cultural debate. Jessica, I wanted to throw it to you. In your sort of opening comments, you talked about the sort of international collaboration and nations coming together to create sort of norms of behavior. So, we have spent a lot of time so far talking about, what nations are doing to kill each other, but what are we doing to deter conflict in space? What are the efforts that are going on right now? And what are the efforts that should be going on? I mean, are we at a juncture where we need sort of another 1967 outer space treaty?
Great question. In some ways, there's a lot going on, and in some ways, there's not a lot going on. Do we need a new outer space treaty for the current moment? I don't think so. I'm currently doing a lot of research to unpack the existing legal and normative landscape in outer space, and there's surprisingly more there than I might have thought when I first started the project, and more work to do than I might have thought when I first started the project. And I think what's reassuring is that we have a lot of rules in space. We have fairly clear international principles in space with coherent agreement around those. And we have some arms control in space. And so I think we have a pretty good basis for going forward. But we're stuck, and we've been stuck for a long time. And international diplomacy on this file has really been stuck for decades. And so how do we move forward beyond this moment? I think we need to have new and different conversations. And that includes collaboration. So when I said there's a lot happening and not a lot happening, I think there is activity happening at a bilateral level, and certainly at a military to military level between the United States and core allies on space, on making sure that there's cooperation and starting to think through what this warfighting mandate might look like. Where I don't see a lot of activity happening is more broadly across, say, non-allies or possible competitors in space. And it's really important to start having that conversation about, what does the future look like and how do we make it stable? What do we want to see happening in space? What do we absolutely not want to see happening in space? What makes us really uncomfortable and might trigger unintended reactions or escalation in space? There is a new initiative being pursued by the United Kingdom this year at the United Nations First Committee. This is exactly the conversation that they're trying to have. They're trying to have a broad, open, bottom-up conversation about what makes us feel unsafe in space. And I think it's a great place to start. I'm hoping a lot of states contribute to it in good faith and really try to have a frank conversation. My concern is that it will degenerate into finger pointing. My experiences at the United Nations the last couple of years have been interesting. There's been a bit of an erosion of diplomacy. It's been dominated by a lot of back and forth accusations and finger pointing between a few key states. And I'm hoping that an initiative this year to have a really frank conversation can maybe move us beyond that point and start thinking about common security and how to stabilize the situation.
Christian, if I could jump in on that point just real quickly, we should not lose sight that norm development is not a one-way street, right? And probably the biggest current norm that is we take so much for granted it's almost invisible to us is that even military and intelligence reconnaissance satellites are allowed to do what prior to the space age we would have called overflying another nation's territory. The Outer Space Treaty and the understandings of what it meant evolved over the time of superpower practice. And we now have treaty agreements separately with the Russians that protect that overflight right for what we euphemistically call national technical means. But that norm, that understanding actually doesn't have to exist forever. And it's possible that some of the developments that are going on and some of the military discussions about weapons in space, to include concepts of weapons that could produce effects on Earth from space, that again seem today mostly like science fiction, but are being discussed in military journals and so forth. Is the U.S. prepared to accept a world in which other nations can field orbital weapons that could produce effects on the Earth? Potentially kinetic effects on the Earth, and that they will overfly US territory every day, multiple times? Those are hard discussions. The norm street could go two ways. And one of the things my colleague Mick Gleason has been trying to do is kind of create a framework for thinking through those problems so that we can be really deliberate about them and choose how we engage diplomatically and also choose what we pursue as a nation.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for that. It seems to me that you can't have a complete conversation about space and national security without a discussion, Brian, of China. And there's a lot of talk you hear in the White House, for example, setting up what, to me, as a journalist, sounds like a construct somewhat similar to the Cold War space race between the United States and the Soviet Union that's now taking place, perhaps to a lesser degree, between the US and China. There's a lot of congressional hawks who speak that way and talk about one of the reasons why we need to accelerate our capabilities in space is to stay ahead of China and to ensure US leadership in space. What do you make of all of that?
Another softball question. So look, let's start by saying China is a serious space power, right? They have a plan that they've been executing for the last couple of decades to develop a wide range of space capabilities for civil space, for science, for human space flight, and for national security space. In many ways, the plan China is executing mirrors what the US did from the 1960s through the 2000s. And they're rolling out a lot of the same capabilities that the US already has. So if I was to kind of put it in a framework, I would say that China is on a path to potentially catch up to where the US is today. And for a lot of people in the US, that's unacceptable. They see space capabilities as part of what keeps America ahead of everyone else. Use the word leadership. Sometimes that could be a code word for dominance or superiority. I prefer actual leadership, but no doubt space is a big part of what gives America its economic, its diplomatic, all those benefits that Jim talked about at the very beginning of this. So that's the concern, is China's on this path to reduce this relative gap. And so there's a push within the US to how can the US, move ahead? How can it leap to the next, curve of benefits and advantages, to use an economics metaphor, and try and stay ahead? Yes, there's quite a lot of rhetoric about what China is doing in space. I think the space race, the new space race, is overblown. First I'll point out that even the original space race was a cultural construct, as it was. The Soviet lunar program, for example, didn't even start until 4 years after we'd already started our program. So the whole moon thing was not really as much of a race as we have since made it out to be in retrospect. I think there's a danger in making too much of a metaphor with the Cold War. We got to remember the Cold War was about a bilateral competition. That is not the world that we're in today. There are other countries, notably Russia, that also pose a concern for the US. But the things we've been talking about, counter space weapons, conflict in space, may not even involve the US at all. You may have a conflict between two other countries in space that could involve space weapons, and neither one of them is the United States. Yet that might have serious impacts for the United States if there's destruction of satellites, widespread jamming of GPS, those types of activities. So one of the big challenges, so I would say one of the big downsides to thinking about this as a space race 2.0 or a Cold War 2.0 is that sort of narrows your focus to only think about China, when we're actually in a much more diverse set of threats and competitions across not only national security, but commercial, across civil, diplomatic. There's a wide range of things. When there's multiple competitions with multiple groups of countries, it is a much more complex landscape, as Jamie talked about as his original remarks, and we need to keep that in mind.
Great, thanks for that. We're getting some questions in through the chat, so I'll read one of them. I think, Jessica, perhaps you could take this, or Jamie. It's from Michael Cooper. On the topic of space arms control, the US space architecture, having been designed when space was seen as a sanctuary, appears to be increasingly vulnerable. Despite this, the US seems to be uninterested in developing or promoting a space arms control agreement. Conversely, Russia and China have proposed a space arms control treaty, but are reportedly developing counterspace weapons that would be considered a violation of such a treaty. Are Moscow and Beijing just trying to force the US to the negotiation table, or are we in the opening stages of a space arms race? What do you think about that, Jessica?
Yeah, I think the current situation is concerning. It seems unstable, and we're certainly seeing the beginnings of a space, I would say a global arms race in which space plays a key role. And so thinking a bit more broadly than space when we're talking about arms racing and arms escalation. Obviously, arms control is my file, and it's a hard file. Arms control is not a topic that is popular these days. I'm really hoping for a revival. We've revived deterrence as a key strategy, and I think it's time that we start reviving concepts of arms control as a security measure rather than arms control as a concession as well, as something we can use to identify and prevent the worst types of activities from happening. How do we do it? I would say how we've been doing it hasn't been working. We've really gotten nowhere. Some of the problems that are highlighted with space arms control are the difficulty of identifying what a weapon in space would be or use of a weapon would be, and verification. I think these are challenges that really pervade all arms control discussions. They're not something we can't overcome. At the same time, there's resistance to coping with them. And so we have to think of other ways to make space safe. So we've been having, as you mentioned, the treaty proposals on the one hand that have really been stalled. There's not agreement on this, and there's not a sense internationally that this is the moment. The other side, the United States has been engaged on, at least on a rhetorical level, which is norms in space. We want to start identifying and promoting responsible behavior to create stability in the strategic environment. What we need now, though, is the next step. This call is echoed over and over and over, and we need to start identifying what those behaviors are. What do we want to see happening in space or not happening? And I think that leadership is needed both to demonstrate through actions what it looks like to be a responsible actor in space, calling out activities consistently that violate what we might expect to be responsible behavior in space. So we see greater transparency and calling out of activities of some countries, particularly Russia lately, but then silence when you have India conducting an anti-satellite weapons test. And so bringing some consistency to that conversation and leadership of action and leadership in dialogue as well, I think can work. And I don't think that is it's not a direct contrast to an arms control discussion. All of this is really about enhancing collective security in space and really creating an environment where we can benefit from space. This is World Space Week, and the motto this year, that the focus is satellites. Satellites improve life, and we need to make sure that we can keep doing that. So that's, I guess, my take.
Another really good question from the audience. So good, in fact, I wish I had thought of it, and I thought about taking authorship of this, but it does come from Martin Whelan of the Aerospace Corporation. Jamie, since he comes from your homestead, I'll let you answer it. And he asks, while norms in space can provide stability and predictability, they also provide limitations to freedom of maneuvering at the tactical level and can provide gray areas for adversaries to exploit and create confusion and havoc. So how do you convince the military leadership that the benefits outweigh the risks of those limitations that come with more codified norms? What do you think, Jamie?
So a great question, and it turns out Marty Whelan is actually my boss, so I'm going to have to be very diligent in answering it. This is a classic trade-off. It is not unique to space. It is not unprecedented. We've been talking about restraints on capability, and typically when people talk about arms control and treaties, they think about quantitative and sometimes qualitative restrictions on capability. SALT, START, New START, right, all have counting rules. And the US has argued fairly consistently that those kinds of things are very hard to police and to verify in the space domain. I think hard doesn't mean impossible, but there are very real challenges there that we have to acknowledge. We also should acknowledge that we have other tools in the toolbox. We have tools of restraints on action, right? The Geneva Conventions govern a whole bunch of what we do with armed forces in times of war and in peace. And it doesn't say you can't have soldiers, but it says your soldiers can't murder prisoners that they've captured and can't maltreat. Those are areas that can be governed by international treaty and can actually create greater barriers to nations taking actions that might be advantageous short-term in a military conflict, but might pose long-term consequences either to, what we see of ourselves as a species, moral principles and things like that, or create greater instability and escalation. So we should not rule out that kind of activity. We're going to have those debates, though, with a serious dialogue about What are we willing to give up in terms of flexibility? What are we willing to retain for ourselves in terms of flexibility, but we would want very, very high standards prior to employing it, right? The US reserves the right to employ nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances, but we reserve that right to the president, right? We are not pushing the decision to employ those weapons down to the tactical level. And then what do we actually believe that, given where technology and international competition is taking us, does have to get pushed down to the tactical level? Because you're going to be exercising it repeatedly and routinely. We don't have the president of the United States approve every maneuver made by the captain of a naval destroyer, even if it's in proximity of a potential adversary's vessel, right? We give them substantial flexibility, and we also let them know, hey, if you're in such and such a situation, please call higher headquarters. So we've got to work our way through these rules of the road and activities internal to the US, but we always have to do it with an eye to what is the international situation we're creating with it. We don't want to have norms in space that make it significantly more likely that actions we're taking in space will be misunderstood and result in a conflict on Earth. But neither do we want to have norms in space that make adversaries think that a coup de main, a fait accompli, some sort of bolt out of the blue in space could dramatically change the correlation of forces on the ground and thereby give them an enormous advantage. That's the balance that has to be struck. We've got to do it in the details, but with a strong strategic set of principles that guide how we approach it.
Yeah, it makes me think there's that old adage that space is hard, but I think usually when people say that, they're referring to the engineering and the technology, but the diplomacy and the geopolitical relations also could be said space is hard. I want to sneak one more question in. We're out of time, but I think it's okay to just go a little bit over. It's a forward-looking question that I think I'll throw to Brian. You're here in Washington. This, of course, is happening in the larger context, as Jane Harman was talking about, of a big political election. If Vice President Biden wins, what effect do you think that will have? Will they continue on with the Space Force? Will they continue on with all of these diplomatic efforts? What does it look like to you going forward? If you could just, gaze into the crystal ball we all know you have on your desk and sort that out for us. Thanks.
Well, keeping up with those softball, easy to answer questions. Look, I hope, and I think it's a good reason to think, that much of what has happened over the last 4 years in the space world is going to continue. And I say that because much of what has happened has been a continuation of long-standing principles and programs and activities that started before the current administration. So we mentioned national security. Before there was the Space Force, there was the principal deputy secretary. There was something called the PDSA. There was other things. There was a whole effort started actually around 2014 on the Obama administration on how do we deal with these emerging counter space threats. Now, the latest incarnation of that effort is the Space Force, but it started well before then. On civil space, as Jim noted, there actually is bipartisan support for the Artemis program in NASA, in Congress. And so I think there's a lot of good reason to think that is going to continue. The commercial things we've been seeing, again, that trend started before the current administration, and the efforts to improve the regulatory and the policy issues around how we promote and encourage and provide oversight of commercial started before the current administration. So I would say that I think thankfully most of what happens in space is not a partisan political issue, or at least it has not been in the past. And so I'll just summarize by saying I think there's good reason to think that at least the substance of what has happened in the last few years will continue under whatever happens to be the next administration.
Well, good. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us. I really appreciate it. Jessica, Jamie, and Brian. That was a real treat we could have gone on. We didn't even get to orbital debris, but maybe that can happen in the next panel, which we will now transition to. So I'll have Therese Jones join us. And of course, you all are welcome to stay with us as we go in. Now, as Jane Harmon was saying earlier, the second panel deals with sort of public-private partnerships and cooperation in space. And I will tell you that it is a great time to be a space reporter at the Washington Post or anywhere. I mean, there is so much going on, from the restoration of human spaceflight to US soil for NASA with the Commercial Crew Program. We had that SpaceX launch. We've got the Artemis program, but we've also got this really interesting moment to talk about this revolution in satellites and small satellite technology. And just this morning, there was yet another SpaceX launch of its Starlink constellation to go to space. I think they have something on the order of 700 satellites. We hope to, at the top of the hour, have Congresswoman Kendra Horn join us, who's been a real leader on these issues as the chairwoman of the Space Subcommittee in the House Science Committee. And we have Therese Jones, who is the Senior Director of Policy at the Satellite Industry Association, who I'm glad to have with us. So I wonder if, Therese, if you could sort of set the stage from your perspective at the satellite industry of talking about broadly what you are seeing. I mean, it just seems like the proliferation of satellites in Earth orbit is just exploding, and because their capabilities are exploding, we're doing much more in space. We're much reliant on space. So I wonder if you could take a moment and walk us through, from your perspective, what that all looks like.
Of course. Thanks so much to the Wilson Center for putting together this panel and to you for moderating such an exciting topic. I'm excited also for Representative Horn, who has been a great leader in Congress on space. So I think you're right. There has been a huge explosion of satellite technology over the past few years. Right now, as of the end of 2019, we had 2,460 active satellites on orbit, which really pales in comparison into what is being planned over the next decade. I would have told you last week that over the next decade, there are 107,000 satellites planned to launch over the next decade. But actually, just recently, there was a Chinese company that announced a constellation of 13,000 more satellites that are going to be on orbit probably by the end of the decade. So we're looking at potentially 120,000 active satellites on orbit. A lot of the satellites that are going to be launched over the next decade are communication satellites. There are these proliferated LEO constellations. So, SpaceX, as you just mentioned, Amazon, Kuiper is another. OneWeb is yet another company that's launching a lot of these communication satellites. And part of the differentiator is certainly satellite manufacturing capabilities, being able to put these communication satellites on smaller buses. But another big part of this revolution is the fact that these companies all see not just the government as a tenant anchor customer, but really there being a commercial market for having communications across the entire globe, whether that's, OneWeb's talked about connecting people in the middle of Africa. A lot of these companies have also provided connectivity to, the maritime and aviation domain. So, that's one really big part of the industry that's exploding right now. Another one that we've seen a lot of development in is certainly remote sensing with CubeSat manufacturing. So CubeSats are 10 by 10 by 10 centimeter, satellites. There are even elementary schools that have launched them. They're very cheap to launch and build. And we've seen remote sensing go from these large, exquisite satellites that are mostly used in the intelligence community to these CubeSats. Like the company Planet uses CubeSats to image the Earth at 1 meter resolution every day. And we've also seen CubeSats, go into other wavelengths, such as synthetic aperture radar, radio frequency mapping. GPS radio occultation, where you measure the diffraction of a GPS signal to measure profiles of the atmosphere and get much more accurate weather forecasting. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. There's been remote sensing regulatory reform that NOAA has really pushed to make licensing these satellites much easier. Even though NOAA licenses them, the licensing process goes through an interagency committee that includes DoD and the IC. So there have been a lot of roadblocks to licensing until recently. And we're hopeful that that will bring, more companies and innovation into the US. Though I should say from an orbital debris perspective, there's some concern that there's an FCC rulemaking right now on orbital debris, and it potentially could require propulsion for all satellites, possibly between above 400 kilometers. And depending on how that rulemaking goes, that may prevent some of these small satellites from launching because there's no propulsive capability out there for them right now.
Yeah, well, there seems to be another roadblock, and that, this has been tried before to put up these large constellations. And we saw, companies with big plans talking about connecting the billions of people who don't have internet access and bringing them on board, only for that, to go bust, which, reminds us of another space adage, the quickest way to become a millionaire in space is to start out as a billionaire. But it does seem like that this time it's different. SpaceX, as we talked about, already is doing it. And Elon, I think, tweeted this morning that they're getting closer to, operational capability. Amazon, and Jeff Bezos have a lot of money and patience and time to back it. And there's some big, I think, technological advances. What do you think, if you could outline, for us, are the differences this time that would give hope to those people who think it's going to happen? Or do you think maybe they could run into some of the same financial roadblocks?
I think there's certainly some concern about financial roadblocks. And I mean, as you mentioned, this has happened before. We don't expect, the full 120,000 satellites that have been proposed to launch. Very modest estimates based on the past would be about 10% of those satellites. So that would be the very conservative estimate if we assume nothing had effectively changed historically, to maybe 30% of those satellites will launch. But I think there is a big differentiator, and that it's one thing SpaceX and Amazon, they are launch providers too, and that cuts down some of the costs. It allows them to have more flexibility in terms of time scale. And so owning the entire supply chain, I think, will help both of them. And then, in the case of OneWeb, we've sort of seen how precarious the industry can be. They were about to go through a round of financing, and then COVID hit, and the last round of financing fell through. They underwent bankruptcy, and then they were bought out in part by the UK government. And so that's a really interesting case because, previously, at least the US itself had not expressed interest in bailing out any of these companies should a bankruptcy occur. But the UK really found it an important part of, their alliance with the US and in terms of their overall defensive strategy to invest in OneWeb. And there are some smaller communications companies as well that are launching, smaller satellites, smaller constellations. There could certainly be some, mergers, acquisitions among them, but at least the manufacturing technology is there right now. So we've got that going for us. They can, manufacture one of these satellites per week. So that's really exciting. I think we'll end up with at least some of these constellations online. Whether or not it's all of them remains to be seen.
So you had mentioned earlier about the regulation of all of this, and we've seen, some of these maps that people have put up showing the proliferation of all of these satellites. Space is obviously big, it's vast, but it's becoming more polluted even. And there is an attempt, by the White House and the National Space Council to lead in this regard, to Space Policy Directive, I think it's 3, to create some rules of the road. And there's a debate going on now over who should have responsibility for that, because it is a little bit like the Wild West. I mean, we saw, was it last year, a near collision of those 2 satellites over Pittsburgh. And even, the Pentagon has that responsibility today, but even if the Pentagon reaches out to a commercial company and says, we think there's a possibility for a conjunction, of a possibility of a collision, they don't have the authority to order that company, or it could be, a foreign government, to move their satellite. Or as you were talking about earlier, that satellite may not even have propulsion to be able to move. So it does seem like there's a lot still to be done in this arena. And I wonder, from your perspective, what needs to happen?
Yeah, so we actually put out a white paper on the future of space and space traffic management last week. And one of those big messages that we got we have about 50 different companies. We require consensus to put out anything. We got all of our companies to agree that space traffic coordination and management, some sort of system, needs to exist now in the US government. It's really urgent for the reasons that you mentioned. The US government has been looking between Space Policy Directive 3 mentions the Department of Commerce and the Office of Space Commerce as the agency that might lead that. The FAA had historically had some role in that as well. Congress needs to delegate, a civil agency to do this. There was a National Academy of Public Administration study that was recently released that suggested the Office of Space Commerce might be the appropriate organization to do it. The question of whether or not there will be rules implemented right away is another issue. I think there are a lot of industry players and government that are working to come up with best practices. But one of the major domains where we're really lacking right now, and the Office of Space Commerce has already sort of stepped in, is on the data side, and creating some sort of open architecture data repository where you're getting better data, not just from the US government on, where these objects are in space, but also being able to input things like planned maneuvers of your satellites. That's not really possible currently. And getting better data even from commercial operators and fusing this data, because right now there's not much transparency coming out of the data from DoD on, what the 1 in 10,000 collision risk that you're getting actually means, where the data is coming from. We've had very different collision risks than Russia has had on several different instances. And that's caused communication issues in terms of, should someone maneuver, should they not? So that's where a lot of cooperation, I would say, needs to happen before we can really get strict space traffic management rules. But I think the US government really is trying to, get out front and lead on this, because there's some recognition too that we need to get the rest of the world on board. So if a Chinese company is about to launch 13,000 satellites, we need to be on the same page as them in space traffic management.
Right. So, I think here at the Wilson Center, in conversations like this, we're a little bit ahead of the curve, but this is not an issue that I think has a big priority with the American public, or frankly, even with Congress. And I think there's a fear that the technology is outpacing the regulation. If you've got, we're talking, not hundreds of satellites, potentially thousands or tens of thousands of satellites being up there, just increasing the risk of a collision. So is there a concern that, what's going to get something done about this, something to inspire change, is another collision? I mean, is that what it's going to take?
I think that's certainly a worry. I mean, we've been very reactive so far with the Chinese ASAT tests and the Indian ASAT tests that were mentioned on the last panel. And then there have been, a number of near misses, whether that's with a commercial operator and a government satellite, or between commercial satellites. Our operators do try to coordinate with one another and generally staff their operations centers 24 hours a day to try to be able to talk through these things. But that's not always guaranteed. I know some of our commercial operators have had near conjunctions with other country satellites and haven't been able to get a hold of the operators in the foreign country because they're on holiday that day. And so they've had to escalate it through very high channels in the federal government to be able to deconflict these conjunctions.
And we are joined by Congresswoman Kendra Horn. Thank you. Hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. It's good to be with you. Apologize for my tardiness running between meetings this morning. So great to be here.
We know you're busy. We're thankful you're busy working on behalf of the American people. And thank you that you could find the time to join us here at the Wilson Center. We've been talking, Congresswoman, about public-private partnerships and cooperation in space at a moment where there's this growing commercial space industry. And earlier in a conversation with Jane Harmon, the CEO of the Wilson Center, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, talked about the increasing reliance on the commercial sector. We rely on companies for cargo resupply to the International Space Station. Obviously had the first launch of NASA astronauts from American soil since the space shuttle was retired in 2011 by SpaceX, looking ahead to their next operational mission. And there's a lot of talk now about extending that paradigm, that public-private partnership, into deep space with the moon. And you have been at the center of those discussions and have some legislation. And I was hoping you could share for the audience, what some of your concerns are about taking that model and replicating it, throughout the space architecture. Does what works in low Earth orbit for cargo, work for human spaceflight to the moon or Mars?
Thank you very much, Chris. It's great to be here, and this is such an important issue. And I think when we're talking about commercialization, public-private partnerships, the question that we need to ask ourselves is what's the right combination? What's the right balance to preserve our leadership in space and continued development in our national interest and scientific advancement and discovery, and also encourage a burgeoning commercial market? What we know is from the history of the U.S. civil space program is that commercial entities, commercial businesses and contractors have been a critical part of this whole process, working with NASA. But it's really been the investment in our national interest of investing in our space program that allowed some of those commercial discoveries to come out as a result of the investment that we as a nation made in space and exploration. It's had amazing benefits, and we've seen this commercial marketplace change the way that we live and interact in the world. And I think there are many benefits to that. And I think that the question here, there's a couple pieces to this, right? In low Earth orbit, we've been there for a long time, right? We've been on the International Space Station, working together with other countries and working in low Earth orbit for 20 years consistently. That's a place that we know. And I think the commercial cargo program is an example of once we've gotten something down, if you will, once we know how things work and we know the parameters, that it's easier to begin to shift that over commercially. Now, that doesn't mean that some of the companies that could do the commercial work can't do government contracting, but it's really what's that balance and what is actually commercial versus what is government contracted, led, and directed. And there are a few other reasons why we need to be thoughtful about this. One is the percentage of government investment, and are there any other outside customers, if you will, and what does that look like? There's also the requirements under our international treaties, outer space treaties, that we have as a nation oversight and direction not only over our own space programs, but even the ability to regulate in a thoughtful way commercial space endeavors. And I look at this. I also sit on the Armed Services Committee and on Strategic Forces about in a few ways. We need to continue to develop our inherent capabilities and our industrial base and encourage more providers. But something that is in the nation's interest, whether it's national security or it's exploration and discovery and science, what should be inherently governmental? And those are the questions that I really think that we have to wrestle with. And I think there is still space. I think sometimes it's framed as a commercial versus government, but that's not the way that I see it. I think that, and I think when we're looking at this, that's not the way that we as a committee have looked at this. It's It's what is inherently governmental, what does NASA and the federal government need to be able, and Congress need to be able to have oversight and insight into to direct these programs. And then what makes sense, where are the technologies developed to a certain extent that there are commercial entities that could do this work. And deep space exploration is more challenging in that way. We need to be able to make sure we go fast, but the responsibility for the safety of our astronauts and for the work that we're doing, ultimately, a lot of it comes back to NASA. So to me, it's about finding the right balance and asking different questions just rather than assuming something is commercial or governmental. It's what is that correct balance?
No, that's a great point. I think, there's a frustration out there, and there has been for a long time, though, that, we went to the moon in 1972, and we haven't been back since. And the moon is, 240,000 miles away, and the International Space Station, marvelous as it is only 240 miles up. And there's a concern and a frustration that NASA hasn't been able to recapture that glory and to go. And not to say that that's necessarily NASA's fault. There have been changes in administrations. There have been, funding, problems in Congress. But, I think a lot of people would argue that what you have now is much more capability in the commercial space sector, so that maybe it's beginning to blur that line between, what is or should be inherently governmental. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I'll take the frustration first, and it's understandable because you're right. I mean, it's been more than 50 years now. We've passed that mark. One of the reasons that we find ourselves here is because of stops and starts and changes in direction between different administrations, changes in how we're approaching things. And that's one of the reasons that we need a long-term plan and policy that spans administrations and Congresses, because space is inherently difficult. And to go back to the moon, I know we've been there, but it's also with a new generation of scientists and engineers and a workforce that wasn't there 50 years ago. So building that capability is a new pathway, and it's inherently difficult. And so again, we need consistent guidance, and the stops and starts are part of the problem. But I think that understanding the differences and challenges, because we can look at the rapid pace of commercial innovation and advancement. We're talking about communications and things like that, and broadband and many things that are coming up that present different challenges and different levels of difficulty than human spaceflight does. And that's why a consistent and long-term strategy with sufficient funding and making sure that decisions and efforts are made in the best interest of what is the highest likelihood of safety or success, safety, and also continuing to move forward. So it's finding that proper balance of mitigating risk with knowing what is acceptable risk. And I think that's where we're in an unknown territory, because we both have a great deal of experience, and also we're doing things or approaching things for the first time. And if we go back to that conversation about commercialization, the path to commercial cargo and resupply was not necessarily a smooth one. It wasn't necessarily a short path. We've been using commercial resupply for the past 8 years, and we're on the cusp of commercial crew. But those also took a long time because space is inherently difficult. So I think part of it is also setting realistic expectations, but sufficient funding requires, I think, the faith of lawmakers as well as industry to continue moving that down the road. And so I think that we have to ask ourselves what it's worth, and we all have to be in it. Authorizers and appropriators, as well as NASA and different administrations, we need some consistency there.
Yeah, just one more quick one for you, and I'll bring it back to Therese.
Yeah.
Setting realistic expectations. We had the NASA administrator on earlier. He talked about the Artemis mission, Artemis 1 flying by November of next year, Artemis 2, a crewed lap around the moon by 2023, with the human landing, next man, first woman on the moon by 2024. Is 2024 a realistic expectation from your point of view?
Well, I know that NASA and the contractors are working hard to keep SLS and Orion, the ground systems moving forward for their for the uncrewed test flight in November 2021. Green Run is progressing. The full static test fire, will also be an exciting thing. So these are yet to be seen. We know that COVID has had an impact on what's been happening in this area. But as for 2024, here's the basic question. It's we still haven't seen a plan that shows us we can get to the moon on this 2024 schedule. That NASA is set up and organized in a way to manage multiple simultaneous large development programs on such an aggressive schedules, or mapping out clearly the lunar and cislunar demonstrations that are needed to enable the human moon to the trip to Mars. And I think that that's what the authorization bill was about, is it setting out this plan and making sure that we have this clear plan and how we get there. That is really the question. I think we should have a bold and aggressive goals. We also need the plan to go along with them to build that confidence, as well as the desire and the vision to go. We've got to have both of those things. I think it's still where we should be headed, but at the same time, we still need to see a plan that shows that it is actually possible.
Right. So Therese, when we talk about public-private partnerships, we've been talking here about how that works. Companies like SpaceX flying astronauts to the station, and companies like Blue Origin building a lunar lander to fly astronauts to the moon. But there's a whole other side to this, on the national security side, where you've seen the Pentagon and the intelligence community kind of look at what's happening in the commercial space sector from a launch perspective, from a satellite perspective, and say, hey, we need to play in this space. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that could mean for the industrial base to have the Pentagon as a customer?
Yeah, sure. So, the defense space strategy that came out in June really looked to commercial to aid the national defense community, and a group of DoD officials and some industry participants also put out a State of the Space Industrial Base report the following month. One of the recommendations was buy what you can, build what you must. And I think that has become more and more integrated into DoD and intelligence community thinking, where they recognize that all of these wonderful commercial capabilities are coming online, and that they should really try to figure out how to utilize them better, not just technologically speaking, in terms of having capabilities at cheaper costs than they might get otherwise in the military, but also from a resiliency perspective and having a diversity of assets on orbit that they can rely on should any of the government assets be attacked. So that's a huge migration in terms of philosophy, I think, for DoD and the IC. But as the last panel mentioned, it really how Space Force plays out, kind of remains to be seen. We've seen, different offices like the Space Development Agency pop up, the Defense Innovation Unit that has worked a lot on, new space technologies, and the Commercial Satellite Communications Office as well, trying to figure out new ways to, go through commercial SATCOM acquisitions that aren't just looking for the cheapest option, but looking for something that's of best value for the US government. So how this is implemented, especially as these offices are integrated under the Space Force, remains to be seen. But I think philosophically, we've seen a huge mind shift.
And, I know you're at the Satellite Industry Association, but, I was over at Wallops last month. A lot of people don't even realize there's a launch facility on the Eastern Shore of Virginia, where there's this growing small rocket capability that's taking off in a company like Rocket Lab or Virgin Orbit. How do you look at, that industry sort of following on, big exquisite satellites and big rockets with smaller satellites, smaller rockets?
Yeah, so that's something else that the government's really interested in too, is this rapid reconstitution capability, especially because, for smaller satellites, they often have to wait for ride shares on bigger ones, and they don't have a lot of say in terms of schedule and when they launch. So that's one reason why, a bunch of small rocket companies are coming to fruition, is just this responsiveness. And the government, would really like a diversity of launch providers to be able to, launch on a much more rapid pace than we've historically seen. We've certainly seen a great increase in launch schedule, even with the bigger rockets with reusability. But just having that responsive capability is something the government's really looking for.
Right. The other thing, Congresswoman, that government is looking at was NASA proposed the Artemis Accords. If we are able to get back to the moon when it's 2024 or 2028 or whatever, one of the things that NASA wants to do is to extract resources from the surface of the moon. The Artemis Accords are designed to create sort of rules of the road. We know from the 2015 Space Act, Congress allowed private companies to extract resources, and that would not be in violation of the Outer Space Treaty. They're not claiming sovereignty of the moon itself or any celestial body, but would create rules so that these companies would be able to have a keep out zone. And now they're putting in place regulations and a program where NASA would solicit companies to scoop up some lunar dirt and to put this in practice. I wonder what you think about all of this. Is it going to run into any problems either with Congress? Do you see this as a point of tension, with allies or potential adversaries? What is your point of view on this?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, because the Artemis Accords, as they stand now, are bilateral international agreements with other nations, of course, that cooperate with NASA. And as you mentioned, the 2015 law, where allows us to use resources without claiming sovereignty. But I think there's two questions. One is how the Artemis Accords apply to commercial companies and their role in this space and in their role here. But I think it also begs a broader question about the importance of international dialogue as we move forward with space exploration. It really is uncharted territory. And we need to ensure that we have dialogue with international partners and consider how these principles apply, Artemis Accords, US law, how they apply to commercial entities, and how they are going to impact our relationships and from an international perspective, because we know that there are many other nations now that are engaging more aggressively in space exploration. So I think that it's important for us to have these conversations now before we get there, so that we can set out some more clear rules of the road that will apply to commercial companies as well as the US government. But an international dialogue in this area is absolutely going to be critical to ensure continued cooperation as much as possible as space gets more and more contested. And I think that that's one of the key issues that we're going to have to wrestle with, and it will have to come from Congress, but also international discussions are going to have to happen. And I don't think there's a clear answer to that yet.
Right. So we've got about 90 seconds left before we need to wrap up. Real quick for both of you, election year, big election year. If Vice President Biden wins, do you see any significant changes, Therese, to what's going on in terms of regulating all of this orbital debris with the satellites? And Congresswoman Horn, do you see any big changes in the Artemis program or any of these major signature programs that NASA has going on? Therese, you first.
I guess first, there's a question of what will happen at the FCC with a potential new chairman if Biden's elected, whether or not orbital debris will still be a priority for the FCC. Also, the big question is the Office of Space Commerce is something that's existed for a while, but this administration has really pushed to, they've wanted to elevate the office to directly under the Secretary of Commerce. And try to put it at the forefront of the work that Commerce is doing. So I think it remains to be seen under a Biden administration if that will still be a priority, or if there will be, more interest in looking to the FAA to help out with space traffic management.
Congresswoman?
I think we're going to see some continuation of a space exploration plan. I think the bipartisan authorization bill that we put together is probably a good model. I don't think you're going to see massive shifts. And with debris and orbital debris issues, I think that this Science, Space, and Technology Committee needs to be involved. We need to make sure that we're making smart decisions about both near-term and long-term management, and with sufficient resources and expertise to address the current and coming issues as we get more players into space. So I think we're going to see a continuation, not a massive shift.
And just real quick, I hope we don't get cut off, but Marcia Smith from Space Policy Online wants to ask, and always gotta, if Marcia asks, we gotta attend to that. Status of the NASA authorization bill.
I think we're going to hopefully get some movement on it after the election. Clearly, COVID interrupted it. We were working towards full committee markup, but has been interrupted. So we're going to continue to work on it. I think hopefully after the election, we'll see some progress, but I'm going to keep working on it. I don't think it's gone. We just have to get it moving. So.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for taking the time to be with us. We know you're very busy. Thank you to the Wilson Center and to the Aerospace Corporation. Of course, to everyone who tuned in, thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.